Hi class, in this video we're going to do the Foundational 15 for Chapter 5. So I have this set up in Google Sheets this time around. I don't have my writing tablet with me, so what I've done is I've covered all of the answers and I'll walk you through each of them. So we'll go through these one at a time, and then by the time we get to the next Foundational 15, it'll most likely be on a regular whiteboard. But there will be some of these Foundational 15s as we move along that we will just do in Excel or Google Sheets just because it works better that way. But this one just happened to be in this format. All right, so for this one, we're given Oslo Company's information. It says they prepared the following contribution format income statement based on a sales volume of 1,000 units, and the relevant range of production is 500 units to 1,500 units. So sales is $20,000 at a level of 1,000 units. Variable expenses, $12,000. That gives us a contribution margin of 8,000. Fixed expenses of 6,000, leaving us with a net operating income of $2,000. So the first question is, what is the contribution margin per unit? So the formula for contribution margin per unit, we can find that a couple of ways. So we can first find the overall contribution margin and then divide that by the amount of units, or if these figures were given to us per unit, we can find the sales per unit and subtract the variable expenses per unit. But since we have all of these in complete dollar figures, we're going to find the contribution margin first in dollars. So our contribution margin, remember, that's going to be your sales minus all things variable, minus all of your variable expenses. So 20,000 minus 12,000, that gives us a contribution margin in dollars of 8,000. So now we want to just convert that contribution margin in dollars to a per unit amount. So the next thing we'll have to do is divide that by the amount of units that were sold here. Okay, so we see here that the unit CM is going to be $8,000 divided by 1,000 units, and that gives us $8 per unit for our unit CM. So exactly what does that mean? So the unit CM tells us for every unit that we sell, that's how much each unit contributes, not only to covering those fixed expenses, but also contributes to that net operating income figure. So if I sell one extra unit, I now have $8 additional to go towards covering those fixed expenses and hopefully giving me a little bit more of a cushion as far as net operating income is concerned. So that's what your unit CM basically tells you. Okay, now the question asks, what is the contribution margin ratio? So same idea, but just looking at the contribution margin in a percent format. Okay, so the contribution margin ratio, how do we find that figure? So that's going to be your CM divided by your sales. So your contribution margin in dollars divided by your sales. So we already know what the contribution margin is in dollars, so that's 8,000. So we're just going to divide that by our sales of $20,000. So that gives us a contribution margin ratio of 40%. Okay, so what does that mean? So for this one, we're going to take a look at, well, for every dollar of sales that comes in, what percentage of that is left over after subtracting our variable expenses? Or in other words, what percentage of each sales dollar coming in will go to contribute to those fixed expenses? Okay, so that's what the percentage figure helps us to look at. Now the variable expense ratio, which is question number 3, it kind of ties into the CM ratio. They're connected to one another. So there's more than one way that we can calculate this. So we'll do the longer way first. So the variable expense ratio, it's the same idea, but instead of it being CM divided by sales, that's going to be your variable expenses divided by our sales. Now we're talking in dollars here. So our variable expenses, that is 12,000, so we're going to divide that by the $20,000 of sales, so we can see the variable expense ratio is 60%. So basically, what does this tell us? This basically tells us that 60% of our sales is consumed by those variable expenses. Okay, so for every dollar of sales that we generate, 60 cents of that will be consumed by variable expenses. But we can also figure this out if you already know your CM ratio like we do. So your CM ratio and your variable expense ratio need to add up to 100% or 1. So another way we could have done this is said, okay, well, we know what the CM ratio is, so we'll do 1 minus the CM ratio. 1 minus 40% gives us 60%. So based on what work you've already done, those are two ways that you can find it. So most likely, if you already have your CM ratio, the second method is probably the quickest and the best way to do it. But if you're only being asked to calculate the variable expense ratio, then you're just going to plug it in like we did initially. Now with question 4, we're asked to use some of this information that we've calculated. So the question is, if sales increase to 1,000 units or 1,001 units, what would be the increase in net operating income? So currently the sales level is at 1,000 units, but now they're saying, what if it goes up to 1,001? What would be that increase in net operating income? Now that's just an increase of 1 unit. So what did we say about the CM per unit, or the unit CM? We said that's how many dollars each unit that we sell contributes not only to covering your fixed expenses, but also to that net operating income. It's essentially the $8 per unit. For every unit we sell, we have $8 more of contribution margin. And what's the contribution margin? It tells us that's how many dollars we have to cover fixed expenses. So if you sell 1 additional unit, how many dollars more will you have in contribution margin? You should have $8 more, right? And if you have $8 more in contribution margin, you have $8 more to cover those fixed expenses, giving you $8 more in net operating income. Okay, so just remember, each additional unit sold contributes an additional $8, not only to contribution margin, but then to fixed expenses and net operating income, because those flow through to one another, right? So in this case, if it's just 1 unit increase, that's $8. Now we can also look at this, what if they were talking about a unit increase of 10? What if sales were to increase by 10 units? What's your increase in net operating income then? Well, if each unit contributes $8, 10 units more times $8 would give us $80 more, not only in contribution margin, but then in net operating income. Okay, number 5 is asking us a similar question, but instead of looking at an increase, we'll look at a decrease. It says if sales decline to 900 units, what would be the net operating income? So just keep in mind for each of these problems, we're just resetting to the original data. So we're not going off of any answers we found in previous problems. So now we're looking at what if we go from 1,000 units sold to 900 units sold. So that's a decrease of how many units? That's 100 units decrease. So if you were to only sell 900 units, you would have 100 units less. That means you have 100 units less contributing not only to contribution margin, but to your fixed expenses and net operating income. So we're again going to go back to that unit CM, right? Because we said that's how many dollars each unit contributes not only to your CM, but your net operating income. So if there's 100 units less all of a sudden being sold, what's the dollar impact on that in terms of net operating income? Well, 100 units times $8 per unit gives us an $800 decrease in net operating income. So if our net operating income was $2,000 before, we're estimating that would decrease by about $800, giving us about a $1,200 net operating income if you were only to sell 900 units. Okay? So just remember that CM per unit can be used to estimate the impact of either an increase or decrease in sales if you know how to use it, right? So again, since there's 100 units less, you're going to have less units contributing to that contribution margin figure and ultimately your net operating figure. Okay, so in this case, we only had sales that was fluctuating, and in the next 2 problems, as we'll see, we're looking at more than one thing changing. And also for problems like 4 and 5, and even the next ones coming up, we're doing this the quicker way, doing it in calculation format based on these formulas that we know. But you can check your work, and I highly recommend that you do this by default. I would set up a new contribution margin income statement for each of these situations, not only to check your work, but also to get more comfortable with the relationship of, sales, variable expenses, CM, fixed expenses, net operating income all together. So for each of these, make sure you're making a new income statement for each of those. Okay, let's take a look at number 6. So this one we're looking at if the selling price increases by $2 per unit and the sales volume decreases by 100 units, what would be the new net operating income? So now we're not just looking at a change in sales volume, but they're saying, what if we charge more per unit? What if that goes up by $2? Well, when we're looking at this kind of situation, if selling price changes or variable expenses change per unit, that's ultimately going to change your contribution margin and also your CM ratio and your unit CM. So we would need to redo all of those calculations now, because how did you find your unit CM before? You're basing it off of sales of 20,000, right, for 1,000 units. So that means you're selling each unit for $20 per unit. But now that's changing to $22 per unit, right? So we need to redo those calculations if we want to anticipate what these changes would be. Okay, so if the selling price changes, then the CM will also change. So the new unit CM, we will basically take the selling price per unit minus the variable expenses per unit, but we need to find those figures first. So the old selling price, that was the 20,000 in sales for 1,000 units. We were selling items for about $20 per unit. But now we're saying we're going to tack on additional $2 to that. So the new selling price is $22. Okay, so now we can find out what our new unit CM is. The variable expenses per unit, that's $12,000 for 1,000 units. So that means our variable expenses comes out to $12 per unit. So what is our new unit CM? So your unit CM was simply your selling price per unit minus the variable expenses per unit. So we now know that would be the $22 now, not the 20, but the $22 minus the $12, leaving us with a $10 per unit CM. So that's our new contribution margin per unit. Now we're going to use that to anticipate the impact that that would have on a decrease in sales of 100. So in this case, when they decided to increase the selling price, one effect of that was a slight drop in sales, right? So that would be one logical thing that might happen if they increase their selling price. But now let's see if increasing that selling price was worth it. Because now all of a sudden, for every unit you sell, it's not just contributing $8 to your net operating income, but it's contributing $10. So each unit you sell has a higher impact. So if you're selling 100 units less, we need to figure out what that new contribution margin is to find out what our new net operating income is. Okay, so our new CM, our new contribution margin, would simply be the 900 units sold, right? If we sold 1,000 and we're selling 100 less, that's 900 units sold times the $10 per unit CM. That's a contribution margin in dollars of $9,000. Well, the new CM minus the fixed expenses, those didn't change, minus $6,000, would leave us with a net operating income of $3,000. If you were to increase selling price by $2 and also experience a decrease in sales volume of 100 units. Well, what was your net operating income before? It was $2,000 before. Now, after increasing your selling price and losing some sales, we have a higher net operating income. We increased our net operating income by $1,000 here. So it looks like this change was worth it. Although they lost a bit of sales volume, they made up for that with the higher unit CM. Although they're selling 100 less units, each unit has more power in the impact that it has on net operating income. So it looks like in this situation, that would have been a good change for them if that was the actual impact that it had. Okay? All right, now for number 7, let's look at what different variables they're giving us now. So again, with this problem, we're assuming we're resetting back to the original data. So don't go off of what you found for number 6. So for this one, it says if the variable cost per unit increases by $1, spending on advertising increases by $1,500, and unit sales increase by 250 units, what would be the new net operating income? So now we're looking at a bunch of things changing. So what's your variable expenses per unit before? Well, we did that up here, right? We found that the variable expenses per unit is $12 a unit. So we know variable expenses per unit don't change within the relevant range as activity changes, right? But now we're actually talking about actually changing what is being spent. So they're probably deciding to spend a little bit more on higher quality materials, so that variable expense per unit is fundamentally changing from $12 to $13. So that's one change. But then they also talk about spending more on advertising. So ramping that up by $1,500. So what category would this increase in advertising spending fall under? Well, that would be an increase to fixed expenses, because usually with this, we set aside a specific amount of dollars to spend on advertising, right? So they're talking about spending on advertising. They're putting another $1,500 aside each period to spend on that category. So we have $1,500 more in fixed expenses. Fixed expenses were $6,000 before. Now it would be $7,500. So we have a new variable cost per unit of 13, new fixed costs of $7,500, and a unit sales increase of 250 units. So that would mean our sales would go from 1,000 to 1,250. Now, that's the hope, right? If you're spending more on advertising and spending a little bit more on higher quality materials, that the impact of that would be an increase in sales. So now let's see, however, if this 250 unit bump in sales is enough to compensate for not only the increased fixed expenses, but also the increase in variable expenses per unit. So we want to look at the overall bottom line impact. So remember, if the variable cost per unit changes, so will the CM. So we need to redo that calculation. So the new unit CM would be our selling price per unit minus your variable expenses per unit. So we're going first to figure out the variable expense per unit. So that was the original 12 plus the 1 gives us 13 per unit. So we're going to take the selling price per unit of $20, right, with the original selling price, minus the new variable expenses per unit gives us a contribution margin of $7 per unit. Because we're spending $1 extra per unit on variable expenses, each unit contributes a little bit less per unit to the contribution margin overall. So $7 instead of the original $8. Now let's find our new contribution margin. So we're selling 1,250 units, right? That's an increase in sales of 250 times your new contribution margin per unit of $7. That would give us a contribution margin of $8,750. So that's how much you would have to cover those fixed expenses and hopefully have something left over, right? So take that $8,750 minus the new fixed expense amount of $7,500 now, right? We added $1,500 to the $6,000. So $8,750 minus $7,500 gives us a new net operating income of $1,250. What was it before? So we have a net operating income of $1,250 when we increase variable expenses per unit, increase our fixed expenses, and then as a result of that, increase sales by $250. Well, before these changes, our net operating income was $2,000 when you're selling 1,000 units. Now, even with sales going up, you have a net operating income of $1,250. So that net operating income fell by $750 in this case, right? So we have to ask ourselves, would that be worth it? Would management from this perspective say, these are our estimates of what would change? Should we go ahead and increase our spending as we have detailed here? In this case, it doesn't quite look like it's worth it, right? Because now, although you're selling 250 more units, those 1,250 units in this case aren't contributing enough dollars to cover and compensate for that increase in fixed expenses. Now you have $1,500 more to cover for. And one way to look at this is say, well, our new CM is $8,750. What was it before? It was $8,000, right? So your contribution margin only went up by $750, but you now only have $750 to cover $1,500 more in fixed expenses. So that increase in contribution margin wasn't quite enough to compensate for that increase in fixed expenses. So in this case, we would probably have to reevaluate and either just say no to these changes or figure out how else they might look to increase the spending in these areas so that the net operating income actually increases above $2,000. Because if it doesn't go above $2,000, none of these changes would be worth it. Okay? Now let's move on to number 8. This is asking what is the break-even point in unit sales? So what's our break-even formula? So if we're finding the break-even point in units, that's simply going to be your fixed expenses divided by your unit CM. Okay, well, we already know both of those. The original unit CM was $8, right? So we're going to take the fixed expenses of $6,000 and divide that by $8 of unit CM to see that we need to sell 750 units to break even. Okay, now let's prove that that actually is correct. So what would be our contribution margin, meaning how many dollars would we have to cover fixed expenses if we only sell 750 units? Well, if we sell 750 units, each of them contribute $8 to contribution margin. That would be $6,000. So you have $6,000 to cover how much in fixed expenses? $6,000. So that contribution margin of $6,000 minus the fixed expenses of $6,000 gives us $0 in net operating income, which would be a point of break even. So that's a calculation to prove that we calculated our break even correctly, at least in units. Now the question is, what's the break even point in unit sales? So the formula for break even in dollars, very similar. The only difference is what you put into the denominator. So remember, if you are finding break even in units, the denominator you use unit CM, but if you're finding break even in dollars, it'll be fixed expenses divided by your CM ratio instead. That's the only difference. But we found our CM ratio already, correct? So if we go back here, in number 2, we found it to be 40%. So we're going to take the fixed expenses of $6,000 divided by 40% to give us $15,000 in break even. So we need to, instead of saying we need to sell 750 units, this is another way of saying, okay, we need to sell $15,000 worth of product in order to break even. Okay, so we could have found this another way as well. If you know how many units you need to sell to break even, which we already found, you can simply multiply that by what you would be selling each unit for to see that, okay, that means I need to generate sales of $15,000 to break even. Now, what about number 10? Instead of saying how many units do we need to sell to achieve a profit of 0 or break even, how many units must be sold to achieve a target profit of $5,000? So with this, the formula that we're going to use in this one, this is our multi-purpose or all-purpose formula. So the target profit calculation in units and in dollars, if you memorize those two, you don't really need to memorize the break even in units and in dollars. And actually need to change this question. This was what was the break even in dollar sales. That's what we were doing in the second one. So if you know what the target profit calculation is both in units and dollars, you already know what the formula is for break even because the target profit is 0 in that case. So we'll get back to that in a second. So what's the target profit calculation if you're trying to find how many units you need to sell to attain a target profit of, in this case, 5,000? Well, your units to attain a target profit is simply going to be your target profit in dollars plus your fixed expenses divided by your unit CM. If we were finding the dollar sales to attain a target profit, you would use the same formula except in the denominator you would use your CM ratio. That's the only difference. So in this case, we're not looking just to cover fixed expenses with our sales. We're looking to cover something a little bit above fixed expenses, in this case $5,000, so we at least have a profit at the end of it all. So our target profit in this case is $5,000, so we'll add that to the $6,000 of fixed expenses and divide that by our unit CM of $8. When we do that, we can see that we need to sell 1,375 units to attain a target profit of $5,000. Okay, so we can take out our calculator here and see what that would be in dollar sales. So if you need to sell 1,375 units to attain a profit of 5,000, well, we know we sell each of them for 20. So in other words, we can say we need to generate sales of 27,500 in order to attain a target profit of $5,000. So let's prove that that would actually be the case. So what do we subtract from sales first? We subtract our variable expenses, correct? So we would subtract from that the 12 times, which is the variable expense per unit, 12 times the 1,375. So let me switch this to a scientific calculator so we can more easily do that. So that was 1375 times 20 gives us the sales. And we'll subtract from that the variable expenses. So that would be $12 per unit times the 1375. That would leave us with a contribution margin of $11,000 minus our fixed expenses of $6,000 leaves us with a target profit, in this case of $5,000. So we did that one correctly. Now, you could have used the same exact formula to find the units to break even. So remember, it's target profit plus fixed expenses. Well, what's your target profit at break even? That would be 0. We would add 0 then to those fixed expenses, leaving us with just 6,000 divided by 8 would give us that same 750. So it's better to memorize the target profit calculations because you just add in 0 for that target profit when you're doing that break-even calculation. Because we can see 0 plus fixed expenses leaves you with that formula we have on the left. They're basically exactly the same formula. Okay, next is, what is the margin of safety? So the margin of safety basically says how much sales did we generate over and above our break-even level. So we know what our break-even is in dollars. That's 15,000. So how much did we generate over and above that? Well, we can, before we plug in to a formula, we can see, well, we generated sales of 20,000 up here. To break even, we need to generate 15,000. So how much more did we generate over and above break even? $5,000. So that's just what the margin of safety is. What's that buffer we have between break even and our actual sales level? Okay, so margin of safety is just actual sales minus your break even sales. So we'll take then the 20,000 minus the 15,000 gives us a margin of safety of 5,000. But then it also asks us, what is the margin of safety percentage? That is just asking, what is that margin of safety in dollars divided by your sales? So what is it as a percentage of sales? So we'll just do the 5,000 divided by the 20,000 to convert it to a percentage. So that would give us a 25% margin of safety. So basically, each dollar in this case, in this situation above, at the sales level of 1,000 units, as we see up above there, every dollar of sales that we generated, 25% of it contributed to that buffer between our actual sales level and break even. Next is, what is the degree of operating leverage? So the degree of operating leverage measures how sensitive our net operating income is to changes in sales. So it has to do with our cost structure. You know, what are our variable expenses and our fixed expenses, and that will impact how sensitive your net operating income is to any changes in sales. Okay, because the fixed expenses are unchanging in total, but the variable expenses in total react proportionately to those changes in sales units. Okay, so what's the degree of operating leverage formula? It's going to be your contribution margin divided by your net operating income. Okay, so in this case, what's our contribution margin? It's $8,000, and we're going to divide that by our net operating income of $2,000. So our degree of operating leverage is 4. So what does that tell us? Well, in this case, for every 1% increase in sales, we can estimate that our net operating income will increase by 4% as a result. So for every 1% change in sales, our net operating income will change or increase by 4%. And the same works for a decrease. So for every 1% decrease in sales, we can estimate a 4% decrease in net operating income. So whatever percentage increase or decrease we're talking about in sales, you just multiply that by whatever you found for degree of operating leverage to determine what that anticipated percent change is in net operating income. So for 13, it says, using the degree of operating leverage, what is the estimated percent increase in net operating income that would result from a 5% increase in unit sales? So we just said if for every 1% increase, we can anticipate that percent change in net operating income. So if sales are to increase by 5%, we would multiply that 5% by that degree of operating leverage of 4. And 5% times 4 gives us a 20% estimated increase in net operating income. So that would just be our estimate of the change. Now you can confirm this by actually setting up a new contribution format income statement, actually saying, okay, sales, if that goes up by 5%, what's my new sales level? And then work your way through, and you will see that the new net operating income, when you set up that new income statement, should be 20% more than what you currently have. So as a check figure, if you were to set up this as a new income statement, we will do 1.2 times 2,000. So your new net operating income with a 5% increase in sales should lead to a $2,400 net operating income. For number 14 is asking, assume that the amounts of the company's total variable expenses and total fixed expenses are reversed. In other words, assume that the total variable expenses are 6,000 and total fixed expenses are 12,000. Under this scenario, and assuming that total sales remain the same, what is the degree of operating leverage? So we're just switching the 12 and the 6. So what would that impact be? So we would first find our new contribution margin. So that would be 20,000, not minus 12 in this case, but minus 6,000. That would give us a contribution margin of 14,000. Now we can find our new degree of operating leverage. Remember, our degree of operating leverage is CM divided by net operating income. And your net operating income wouldn't change in this case, right? Because you're just switching where the expenses are being subtracted, but all of the expenses in total that we're subtracting here are staying the same. So we should have the same net operating income, because then we would take this contribution margin of 14,000 minus 12,000 gives us $2,000 left over. So our degree of operating leverage would be CM divided by net operating income. So in this case, we'll take that contribution margin of 14,000 divided by your net operating income of 2,000. And that gives us a new degree of operating leverage of 7. It was 4 before, but now we have a degree of operating leverage of 7. So in this case, for every percent increase in sales, you're going to see a higher jump in net operating income percentage-wise. So with 15, they're saying, using the degree of operating leverage that we just computed, what is the estimated percent increase in net operating income that would result from a 5% increase in sales? So we're just going to take that 5% estimated increase in sales and multiply it by that degree of operating leverage of 7 to see what that estimated increase in net operating income would be. Well, 5% times 7 gives us 35%. So we would estimate that our net operating income would go up by 35%. Or in other words, we take 1.35 times 2,000, our new net operating income would be about $2,700 by our estimates. But again, you would plug in to that contribution format income statement to confirm that you are left with $2,700. So that's a good idea to practice that. All right, that's it for our Chapter 5, Foundational 15.